The cameras were already rolling when it happened. Studio lights blazed down, catching every flicker of expression. Every twitch of the jaw, every bead of sweat that betrayed nerves beneath polished surfaces. The air felt electric, heavy with the kind of tension that makes you lean forward, waiting for something explosive. And then, like lightning, Jasmine Crockett delivered the words that would ignite the moment. Kash Patel had just finished smirking through yet another self-assured dismissal, his tone dripping with condescension, his posture screaming superiority. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied, as though he had scored some invisible point. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in, calm and deliberate, and unleashed a response so sharp, so cutting, that the entire panel froze. For a split second, silence. The kind of silence that crackles louder than applause. Then the room erupted not with sound, but with energy. Gasps rippled across the audience. Heads turned. A producer in the corner widened his eyes, mouthing words off camera. Crockett's delivery was surgical, precise, unflinching, devastating. Patel, who just moments earlier wore that smug half-grin, found it slipping away, replaced with something he hadn't planned on showing discomfort. It wasn't just what Crockett said, it was how she said it. Her body language radiated composure. Every gesture intentional, every pause sharpened for maximum impact. Meanwhile, Patel's confidence faltered, his shoulders tightening, his eyes darting in search of an escape route that simply didn't exist. In real time, viewers at home clipped the moment, screenshotted expressions, hit replay again and again. The panel tried to keep its balance, but it was impossible. The energy had shifted. The villain's bluster was cracking, the hero's resolve, burning brighter with each passing second. And as Crockett's words hung in the air, it became clear this wasn't just another exchange of talking points. This was a public undoing. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something viral. Clash that wasn't scripted, a humiliation that couldn't be undone. Patel's silence screamed louder than his boasts ever had, and Crockett's calm stare was the punctuation mark at the end of it all. But to truly understand why this moment shook the room, you have to know what led to this collision. The confrontation didn't happen in a vacuum. To understand why this clash sent shockwaves through the country, you have to understand the battlefield that took place on a political climate already stretched thin, already burning with culture wars and partisan gamesmanship. Every exchange on live television wasn't just about words anymore. It was about symbolism. It was about which version of America would claim the stage. Kash. Patel entered this environment like a man convinced he was untouchable. He had carved out a reputation as a combative insider, the kind of political operator who thrived on loyalty to power rather than loyalty to principle. He was combative, sharp-tongued, and dangerously comfortable playing the role of attack dog. Audiences had seen him before snapping at opponents, rolling his eyes at critics, brushing aside tough questions with rehearsed confidence. To him, debate wasn't dialogue. It was domination. He believed if he sneered long enough, if he smirked convincingly enough, he could make arrogance look like strength. But arrogance only works when the person across from you is willing to shrink. In Jasmine Crockett, she was never built for shrinking. Crockett came into that studio as more than just another panelist. She carried herself like someone who knew the weight of the moment, like someone who had spent her entire career preparing. To confront exactly this kind of opponent, her voice had always been unapologetic, unpolished, in the best way grounded in truth, not rehearsed talking points. In a landscape where too many politicians tiptoe around confrontation, Crockett had become known as the kind of truth-teller who cuts through the noise. She wasn't afraid of labels, of being called too bold or too loud, because she understood something deeper. Her boldness wasn't for her. It was for everyone watching who'd been told to sit down, to pipe down, to stay invisible. That's why this clash mattered. It wasn't just Crockett versus Patel. It was dignity versus arrogance, truth versus deflection, authenticity versus performance. Patel represented an old political playbook: overwhelm your opponent with condescension until the audience mistakes it for authority. Crockett represented a new voice rising, one that didn't ask permission to exist, one that refused to fold. Under the weight of smugness, in that sense, the tension was more than personal. It was generational. It was cultural. It was America in microcosm, distilled into a single broadcast moment. Patel embodied a system that prizes connections and loyalty to power. Crockett embodied the outsider who refuses to bow, who knows her very presence is a disruption to the status quo. That's why viewers didn't just watch with curiosity, they watched with anticipation. Because everyone knew that when Patel squared up against Crockett, it wasn't going to be a polite exchange of ideas. It was going to be a test of composure, a test of authenticity, a test of whether smug theatrics could still silence voices that were finally, unapologetically rising. The stakes stretched far beyond the studio. For Patel, it was a chance to reassert dominance, to prove that his bluster still worked. For Crockett, it was an opportunity to show that arrogance could be dismantled with dignity. For the audience, it was validation. A reminder that no matter how loud the sneers or how deep the dismissals, truth has a way of cutting through. And when the camera started rolling, Patel thought he could control the room. Was wrong. Kash Patel didn't just walk into that studio by accident. His rise was no fluke, no lucky break. He had built an entire career out of playing the role of partisan warrior, fiercely loyal, unyielding in defense of the powerful and always willing to say what others wouldn't. To some, he was a soldier. To others, he was a wrecking ball. But to everyone who had ever faced him across a debate table, he was one thing above all else: a master of deflection. From the earliest days of his political ascent, Patel learned the art of turning every question into an opportunity to attack. If asked about policy, he pivoted to personality. If pressed on facts, he smothered the discussion with accusations. His method wasn't to engage, it was to overwhelm. Discovered that, in a media landscape addicted to conflict, the loudest voice often wins the most airtime. And so, he made volume his weapon. The arrogance came naturally. On camera, he perfected the smirk, the slow shake of the head, the chuckle that suggested his opponent was naive, even laughable. Off camera, he carried himself with the same swagger, often dismissing critics as irrelevant. When journalists challenged his shifting stories, he leaned on loyalty. Those in his camp saw him as unflinching, while everyone else was treated like an enemy. His contradictions became part of the performance. One day he presented himself as a truth-teller, exposing the so-called deep state. The next, he sidestepped uncomfortable facts with a grin and a shrug. There were stories moments. Colleagues whispered about that, revealed the insecurity beneath the bluster. In private meetings, Patel sometimes snapped when pressed for detail, lashing out before retreating into silence. Those who worked with him said he thrived on control, but flinched at genuine accountability. The swagger, they noted, was armor. Armor against being exposed. Armor against losing face. And losing face, for Patel, was the one thing he couldn't stomach. That insecurity gave rise to his well-worn playbook, the same one he carried into every high-stakes encounter. Step 1. Overtalk. Dominate the conversation, flood it with so many words that your opponent barely has space to breathe. Step 2. Smear. Turn criticism into an attack on your accuser, muddying their credibility until the audience questions their motives. Step 3. Distract. When cornered, shift the subject entirely. If facts get uncomfortable, change the battlefield. It was a strategy that had worked for him time and time again. On cable news, he had reduced seasoned interviewers to stammering as he bulldozed over their questions. In political hearings, he leaned on theatrics, tossing barbed insults to throw rivals off balance. Among his allies, these tactics were celebrated. As strength, to his opponents, they were infuriating. Like wrestling smoke, he was never where you thought he'd be. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the most seasoned fighters. Patel began to believe his own myth that the smirk was unbeatable, that the chuckle was untouchable, that the playbook would never fail him. He mistook deflection for dominance and distraction for victory. He convinced himself that if he kept talking long enough, truth would always bend in his direction. That belief made him reckless. It's why he underestimated who was sitting across from him that night. To him, Jasmine Crockett was just another voice to bulldoze, just another opponent to sneer at. He assumed she would fold under pressure, that she would be rattled by interruptions, that the same tactics that had worked so many times before would work again. What he didn't realize was that Crockett had studied men like Patel her entire life. She had grown up facing dismissals and underestimations, and she knew the rhythm of arrogance like a song she'd heard 1,000 times. His tricks were not surprises to her. They were rehearsals for her strength. Patel entered that studio, convinced he was in control, convinced the smirk, the swagger, the rehearsed dismissals would leave him unscathed. But little did he know, the very tactics he relied on would become his undoing. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive on that stage with the privilege of assumption. She wasn't born into a dynasty, she didn't coast in on connections, and no one ever handed her a ready-made platform. Her story was forged in the grit of working-class roots, in communities where opportunity wasn't guaranteed, and where voices like hers were too often silenced before they ever had the chance to be heard. Growing up, Crockett knew what it meant. To be underestimated, she knew the weight of being told no, the sting of being overlooked, the constant pressure of having to prove herself twice over just to be taken half as seriously. Those early experiences didn't weaken her. They sharpened her. They turned every dismissal into fuel, every insult into motivation. By the time she stepped into public service, she had already weathered storms that would have broken others. Her path was not smooth. She faced the gauntlet of early political life, the cheap shots, the sideways glances, the critics who dismissed her as too young, too bold, or too unapologetic. They said she didn't belong. They tried to box her in, to strip away the very qualities that made her stand out. But Crockett refused. She doubled down. Where others softened their tone, she sharpened hers. Where others avoided confrontation, she leaned into it with clarity and force. Her legal background gave her the discipline of precision. She had stood in courtrooms where the stakes were measured in lives and futures, and she learned that every word mattered. Every pause mattered. Every refusal to back down mattered. That training carried with her when she stepped into politics. To her, speaking truth wasn't just performance, it was responsibility, survival. Those who followed her rise began to see a pattern. Crockett never ducked a fight. When attacked, she answered with wit and fire. When underestimated, she responded with evidence and eloquence. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she delivered them. She had that rare combination of sharpness and composure, the ability to cut through nonsense without ever losing control of the room. It made her both admired and feared, depending on which side of the exchange you stood. And yet, Crockett never forgot who she was fighting for. Her voice wasn't for elites, or insiders, or those already comfortable in power. She carried the stories of working families, immigrants, and underrepresented communities into spaces that often tried to shut them out. She understood what it meant to walk into a room where no one expected you to belong. She made it her mission, not just to belong, but to dominate, to shift the balance, to prove that dignity and truth could still command attention even in the noisiest of arenas. By the time she stepped into that studio opposite Kash Patel, Crockett had become known for exactly that, fearless articulation. Commentators called her razor sharp. Constituents described her as the fighter we've been waiting for. To her opponents, she was relentless, a voice that refused to be quieted, even when the pressure mounted. She had been through smear campaigns, public mockery, and relentless attempts to undermine her. And every time, she emerged stronger, more unshakable. That's why this particular confrontation mattered so much. On the surface, it was just another televised clash. But for Crockett, it was bigger. It was symbolic. Patel wasn't just another talking head. He represented an entire culture of arrogance, of belittling, of using bluster to silence. Crockett knew that if she could withstand him, dismantle him, humiliate him on his own turf, it would be more than a win for herself. It would be validation. For everyone who had ever been dismissed or disrespected by men like him, this was more than a debate. It was a proving ground. It was an opportunity to show the nation that the tactics of arrogance and dismissal were no match for resilience and clarity. It was a chance to show that authenticity, not smugness, would win the day. Crockett carried with her not just her own dignity, but the dignity of those watching at home, waiting for someone to finally push back. So when she sat under those brightstudiolights.com, composed, unbothered by Patel's theatrics, it wasn't because she was immune to pressure. It was because she had been here before, in one form or another, her entire life. She knew this script. She knew how arrogance sounded, how dismissal looked, how bluster fell apart under the weight of truth. And when Patel made his move, Crockett's years of resilience prepared her for the perfect response. The first few minutes of the debate played out exactly as Patel had scripted it in his mind. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice projecting with the confidence of someone who believed volume alone was proof of victory. He fired off rehearsed attacks with machine-like precision, each line polished to sound devastating, each barb designed to rattle. He interrupted with ease, cutting off sentences before they could land. And with every smug dig, he glanced around the studio, looking for validation in the eyes of producers and fellow panelists. At first, it seemed to work. Crockett remained quiet, her expression unreadable. Patel mistook her silence for weakness, a chance to seize control of the narrative. He chuckled at his own lines, shaking his head with practiced disdain, as if every point Crockett might offer was already beneath him. The audience, caught between amusement and discomfort, let out small bursts of uneasy laughter. A few heads nodded reluctantly, but more eyes flickered nervously toward Crockett. Waiting, anticipating, Patel pressed harder. He piled exaggerations on top of half-truths, weaving insults into his arguments. Tossing sideways jabs meant to undermine her credibility. He spoke so quickly that his words nearly blurred together. A verbal avalanche meant to bury his opponent before she had the chance to dig herself out. And still, Crockett didn't interrupt. She didn't match his speed or volume. She just sat there, absorbing each word, her posture poised, her face betraying nothing but patience. That patience unnerved some of the panel. Commentators shifted. In his seat, sensing the imbalance wasn't as secure as Patel thought. A producer behind the camera raised her eyebrows, whispering to a colleague she's waiting. In that single word hung a warning, a premonition. Patel was playing with fire. He didn't know it yet, but arrogance clouds perception. Patel leaned back in his chair after another round of digs, clearly believing he was in control. He smirked, gesturing toward Crockett with a dismissive wave, as though he had already won. He mistook her restraint for surrender. What he didn't realize was that her silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy, and then cracks began to show. His rhythm, so carefully rehearsed, faltered when Crockett refused to flinch. His smirk lingered a beat too long, revealing strain beneath the act. The more he talked, the more desperate his volume sounded, not commanding, but compensating. His words started to overlap, tangling into each other as if his confidence was sprinting ahead of his composure. The audience sensed it before he did. The uneasy laughter quieted, replaced by a stillness heavy with expectation. Viewers at home leaned forward, feeling the tension shift, realizing the dominance was beginning to slip. Patel was talking louder, faster, sharper, but he wasn't landing blows anymore. He was shadowboxing against silence, and silence was winning. Crockett tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She let Patel continue, let him unravel in real time. Her expression was not that of someone cornered, it was the look of someone studying, calculating, preparing. She gave him the rope, and he took it, wrapping himself tighter with every exaggerated insult, every desperate jab. And then the moment arrived. Patel's latest volley of attacks trailed off, his words colliding with one another until they dissolved into frustrated noise. The silence that followed was deafening. The panel turned toward Crockett. The audience leaned in. Even Patel, for the first time that evening, looked unsure of what would come next. And then, with the room hanging on every word, Crockett struck back. The silence after Patel's rant was thick, almost suffocating. He leaned back, a self-satisfied grin still tugging at his lips, confident that he had buried his opponent under a mountain of words. But Jasmine Crockett didn't look buried. She looked ready. She drew in a slow breath and leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice calm, steady, almost too steady. The room chuckled nervously. Patel tried to laugh along, but the smirk didn't quite reach his eyes. And then it began. Crockett's first point landed with surgical precision, dismantling Patel's opening attack. She didn't shout. She didn't rush. She simply laid out facts with a clarity that cut sharper than any insult. Her voice was deliberate, measured, each word spaced perfectly so it echoed in the air before Patel could even think about interrupting. "Let's be clear," she said, locking eyes with him. "What you just offered wasn't an argument, it was a distraction. Frankly, it's the same distraction we've heard from you time and time again." The audience gasped. On social media, the first tweets began to fly. Crockett just flipped the script on Patel. Hashtag live TV chaos. Patel shifted in his chair, chuckling dismissively, but Crockett didn't give him the oxygen to recover. She pivoted to his second claim, exposing contradictions he thought would slip past unnoticed. Each revelation hit like a drumbeat pause. Statement, reaction, escalation. You say you care about accountability, but every time accountability comes knocking, you change the subject. A pause, a murmur of agreement from the audience. You talk about integrity, yet your entire defense is built on arrogance. A pause. Louder murmurs now. One panelist biting back a smile. "And you claim victory every time you interrupt someone, but victory isn't how loud you are? Victory is when truth survives the noise." A pause. Applause breaks out in the back of the room. Patel's face tightens. Patel tried to interject, but Crockett's rhythm was unbreakable. She raised a hand lightly, not in a gesture of command, but in quiet control. "You've had your turn. Now it's my turn." The authority in her tone silenced him. She pressed on, building momentum. Every sentence stacked atop the last, exposing not just Patel's tactics, but the hollowness behind them. She didn't need to insult him. She let his own words collapse under scrutiny. By the third dismantled point, Patel's interruptions had turned into nervous laughter. By the fifth, he had no laughter left. The audience leaned forward, captivated. Tweets flew faster. "Crockett is cooking him alive. This is what composure looks like under fire. Patel just got bodied on national TV." Then came the escalation. Crockett shifted from defensive rebuttal to offensive strike. Her tone still calm, but her words sharper, harder, unmistakably final. "Here's the problem, Mr. Patel. You think debates are about performance? You think if you sneer long enough, smirk wide enough, people will mistake arrogance for strength. But arrogance is not strength. It's weakness. It's weakness loud, weakness pretending to be power." Gasps shot through the room. Patel blinked, his jaw tightening. He tried to respond, but no words came. His mouth opened, then closed again. Like a boxer searching for footing after being hit harder than expected, Crockett didn't stop. She delivered. The final blows, each one landing heavier than the last. "You can overtalk me. You can interrupt me. You can even try to dismiss me. But what you cannot do, what you will not do, is silence me, because I don't speak just for myself. I speak for every person watching who's tired of arrogance being dressed up as authority." The studio erupted. Applause, cheers, even laughter, directed not at Patel's jabs, but at Crockett's devastating clarity. On Twitter, hashtags exploded. Hashtag Crockett vs. Patel. Hashtag truthbomb. Hashtag humiliated. Clips began circulating instantly. Captions like, "THIS is how you handle arrogance." Patel's composure unraveled in real time. He stammered, trying to claw back control. That's not what I've... But the damage was done. His words tripped over themselves, incoherent, defensive. The smirk was gone. The swagger had collapsed. And all that remained was the raw discomfort of a man who had just been dismantled on live television. Crockett sealed the moment with a final line, delivered with devastating calm. She leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on him, and said, "The truth doesn't need to shout to be heard, but tonight it needed to put you in your place." The silence that followed was thunderous. Then the room erupted again: applause, laughter, murmurs that Patel had just been finished. Even fellow panelists exchanged knowing looks. On screens across America, viewers replayed the clip again and again. Savoring the mic drop moment, Patel tried one last time to salvage dignity. But his words collapsed under the weight of Crockett's precision. His face flushed, his voice trembled just enough to betray him. And the audience knew the fight was over. The clash had ended in humiliation. Not for Crockett, but for the man who thought arrogance could outlast truth. And as Crockett sat back, calm and unshaken, the contrast couldn't have been clearer. Swagger dismantled by composure, noise silenced by truth. The exchange was over. But the real explosion was only beginning. The moment Crockett delivered her final line, the studio may as well have been struck by lightning. Producers scrambled, panelists whispered to one another, and Patel sat frozen, his usual swagger visibly shaken. But outside the walls of that studio, the real storm was already gathering. Within minutes, clips of the exchange hit Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The hashtags wrote themselves. Hashtag Crockett vs. Patel, hashtag truth over arrogance, hashtag mic drop. Edits appeared almost instantly: slow-motion replays of Crockett's takedown. Set to triumphant music, Patel's fumbling words looped again and again for comedic effect. On TikTok, users remixed the moment with captions like, "When you bring a smirk to a truth fight." Memes spread at lightning speed. Patel's once confident grin became a template for jokes, captioned, "When you realize the homework wasn't optional." Another viral image showed Crockett leaning forward mid-response with the text, "The face of someone who did the reading." Humor carried the humiliation. But beneath the laughter, there was something deeper. A collective recognition that arrogance had finally been checked. Commentators wasted no time amplifying it. Morning talk shows replayed the clip on loop, anchors remarking this was the moment Patel was humbled on live television. Pundits dissected the body language, the tightening of Patel's jaw, the composure in Crockett's stare, the electricity. In the room, when the audience realized the power had shifted, even neutral outlets couldn't resist acknowledging the obvious. Crockett had not just survived. Patel's tactics, she had dismantled them. For Crockett's supporters, it was validation. She wasn't just another politician fighting to be heard. She was a truth-teller, someone unafraid to confront arrogance head-on. Tweets poured in from fans who had long felt dismissed by figures like Patel. Finally, someone said what we've all been thinking. She didn't just win the debate, she spoke for us. In communities where voices had too often been silenced, Crockett's words resonated like a rallying cry. Meanwhile, Patel's reputation took a bruising. His allies tried to spin the exchange as heated debate, but the internet wasn't buying it. The humiliation was too clear, too viral, too undeniable. Ere a damned he made to regain footing online was met with gifs of his failed comebacks. Screenshots of his stunned expression and sarcastic replies reminding him of the night. He was publicly dismantled. The swagger that had carried him through countless encounters had finally been punctured. Late-night comedians piled on, weaving the clip into their monologues. One joked Patel came to a debate with a smirk, and Crockett handed him a reality. Check. Another quipped, that wasn't a debate, it was an intervention. Laughter filled living rooms across the country. Patel's name became less associated with power and more with embarrassment. But beyond the jokes, something more profound was happening. The clash became larger than just Crockett and Patel. It became a cultural moment, a shorthand for what happens when arrogance collides with authenticity. Teachers played the clip in classrooms as an example of composure under fire. Activists cited it as proof that truth could still pierce through noise. Ordinary viewers, scrolling through their feeds, felt a spark of empowerment. If Crockett could stand unshaken in the face of arrogance, maybe they could too in their own lives. The ripple effect was undeniable. Hashtags trended for days, turned into digital folklore, and the story of Patel's humiliation became less about one man's stumble and more about a collective hunger for voices that refused to be silenced. Crockett had struck a nerve. The resonance reached far beyond political junkies. It reached anyone who had ever wanted to see dignity triumph over condescension. And yet, as powerful as the viral moment was, it wasn't the whole story. Because the true meaning of this clash, the reason it etched itself into the cultural memory, wasn't just about Crockett and Patel. When the dust settled and the laughter, applause, and memes began to fade into the background, the meaning of what had just unfolded came into focus. Crockett's victory wasn't just about a single exchange or even about putting Patel in his place. It was about something bigger, something deeper, the triumph of dignity over arrogance. In that studio, we witnessed more than a clash of personalities. We saw a microcosm of democracy itself, two visions of America colliding under the bright lights of live television. On one side stood the tactics of deflection and propaganda, sharpened by years of partisan games. On the other stood truth, spoken calmly, fearlessly, and without apology. The result was clear. Noise can distract for a moment, but truth delivered with courage. Crockett's composure in the face of Patel's theatrics was a reminder that strength isn't measured by volume, but by clarity. It isn't measured by how many times you can interrupt, but by whether your words resonate after the noise dies down. Her victory was not just personal, it was collective. It belonged to every viewer who had ever felt silenced. Every worker told their opinion didn't matter. Every immigrant who had been dismissed. Every person of color who had been underestimated. That is why the moment struck such a chord. Validated something universal, that arrogance is fragile and dignity is unbreakable. When arrogance shouts, dignity waits. And when dignity finally speaks, it is undeniable. This clash became proof that resilience can outlast ridicule, that courage can dismantle even the most polished facade, that the voices of ordinary people, the ones who don't come from privilege, who don't have built-in power, who have had to fight for every ounce of recognition, still matter and can still shift the balance. Crockett's voice was more than hers alone. It echoed as a chorus of millions who were tired of being silenced by smirks and swagger. It's easy to believe. In our polarized world, that truth has lost its power. That noise drowns everything. That arrogance always gets the last word. But what we saw in that studio proves otherwise. It proves that integrity, courage, and resilience still have a place not just in politics, but in the spirit of America itself. Because this wasn't just a takedown, it was a reminder. A reminder that democracy is not about who talks the loudest, but about who speaks with the most honesty. A reminder that strength is not in intimidation, but in conviction. A reminder that our nation has always moved forward when ordinary people stood their ground against those who tried to dismiss them. That's why Crockett's moment will be remembered not as a soundbite, not as a meme, but as a testament to what happens when truth refuses to be silenced. And that's why this wasn't just a takedown, it was a reminder of who we are. Asterisk and so. The headline writes itself. Live TV chaos. Jasmine Crockett humiliates. Kash Patel with a brutal response. The chaos was real, the humiliation undeniable, and the response nothing short of brutal in its precision. But as we've seen, it was more than just spectacle. It was a defining moment, a reminder that arrogance collapses when confronted by dignity, and that justice wins when truth is louder than noise. Crockett's words cut through the fog, not just to put Patel in his place, but to send a message that resonates far beyond that studio. She showed that poise, resilience, and courage still have the power to silence arrogance. She showed that when truth stands tall, it doesn't just defend itself, it inspires others to do the same. And now, it's your turn. If you felt the power of this moment, if you saw yourself in Crockett's calm defiance, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories that reveal the real battles shaping our democracy. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder that dignity still triumphs. Add your voice to the conversation, because every like, every comment, every share is part of building something bigger than just one debate. It's about building a movement where truth, courage, and justice are impossible to ignore. Because in the end, Crockett's words weren't just for Patel. They were for all of us.